Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. You know, there's something almost sacred about this moment. Right now, wherever you are, you're warm. Perhaps you're beneath layers of soft blankets. Or maybe there's a gentle hum of heating keeping the cold at bay. The world outside your window might be dark, might even be winter where you are, but you're safe, you're comfortable, and yet, tonight, I want to take you somewhere that comfort never reached. Not because I want to disturb your peace, but because sometimes the deepest rest comes when we understand just how far we've traveled from the edge of survival. There was a time, not so terribly long ago, when winter wasn't just a season. It was a test, one that many failed. The men I'm going to tell you about tonight, they didn't have what you have. No thermostat to adjust, no electric blanket, no grocery store 3 blocks away. What they had was something else entirely. Something we've almost forgotten how to recognize. They had the knowledge that comfort, real comfort, the kind that keeps you breathing through the night, doesn't come from what surrounds you. It comes from what you're willing to endure. And they had teachers, silent teachers, mostly women whose names history rarely recorded. Women from the Crow and Shoshone nations who showed them how to turn a buffalo hide into shelter, how to read the sky for storms, how to survive what should have killed them. Without speaking much at all, these women taught survival with their hands, their patience, their ancient knowledge. Tonight, you'll hear about a moment when everything came down to something impossibly small. An ember, not larger than a single grain of corn. One man, in the darkest hours of a blizzard, digging through snow with frozen hands, searching for that tiny spark, finding it, bringing it back to life. That ember, smaller than you can imagine, became the difference between 2 men living and 2 men dying. This is a story about cold, but more than that, it's about the small fires that kept burning when everything else wanted to freeze. It's about men who learned that sometimes the only way to survive is to stop fighting for comfort and start embracing the discomfort itself. To make friends with the very thing trying to kill you. So settle in. Let the weight of your blankets remind you of how lucky you are. And let me take you back through the years, to a winter that refused to end, and the men who refused to surrender to it. Are you ready? Good. Then let's begin. Picture this, if you will. The year is 1845, somewhere in the Arctic. A British expedition led by Sir John Franklin has set sail with every advantage Victorian England can provide. They have ships reinforced with iron. They have tinned food, thousands upon thousands of cans. They have libraries, fine china, silverware. They even have a small organ for Sunday services. 129 men, the best the Royal Navy can offer. Not one of them will survive. Because winter, you see, doesn't care about your advantages. It doesn't care about your technology or your confidence or your careful plans. Winter is patient. Winter waits. And when you make your mistake, because you will make your mistake, winter simply stands there and watches as you freeze. Now, shift your mind westward and backward a bit, to the 1820s, to the Rocky Mountains of what will become the American West. Here, there are no ships, no tinned goods, no organs. There are only men with names like Jedediah and James and Joe, walking into the same merciless cold that will swallow Franklin's expedition whole. They're trappers, traders, wanderers. The polite society back east calls them mountain men, though that name doesn't capture what they really are. They are survivors of a different education entirely. These men live through winters that the Franklin expedition, with all its preparation, cannot fathom. And they do it without iron-reinforced ships or stockpiles of provisions. They do it, paradoxically, by having less, by wanting less, by understanding something that our modern world has worked very hard to forget. They understand that in the cold, comfort is a lie, and believing that lie will kill you faster than the frost ever could. Let me tell you what winter was like in those years. We're talking about the tail end of what scientists call the Little Ice Age, a period when temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped lower than they had in centuries. In 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted with a force that would reshape global climate. The ash and sulfur dioxide it threw into the atmosphere dimmed the sun, and the following year, 1816, became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed across America and Europe. Snow fell in June in New England. Frost killed harvests in July. Food prices skyrocketed, and hunger drove people from their homes. Many young men, facing starvation in the settled East, looked westward toward the frontier, toward the Rocky Mountains where beaver pelts could make a fortune, where a man might escape the famine and find his future. They didn't know they were walking into something colder than anything their grandfathers had known. The effects of Tambora rippled through the decades that followed. The Rockies, already brutal, became something else entirely. Winters stretched longer. The cold bit deeper. And the men who went into those mountains, chasing fur and freedom, found themselves tested in ways they couldn't have imagined. Let me tell you what winter was like in those years. We're talking about the tail end of what scientists call the Little Ice Age, a period when temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped lower than they had in centuries. The winter of 1816, called the Year Without a Summer, came after the eruption of Mount Tambora, and its effects rippled through the decades that followed. The Rockies, already brutal, became something else entirely. Imagine a cold so complete that it feels alive. A cold that doesn't just chill your skin, but seems to reach inside you, wrapping fingers around your lungs, making each breath a sharp reminder that you're still, for now, breathing. Rivers that should flow freeze solid, 3 feet of ice and more. Snow doesn't fall gently. It attacks in waves, in blizzards that can last for days, turning the world into a white void where up and down lose meaning. In these mountains, in valleys like the Wind River or along the Green, winter temperatures regularly plunged to 30, 40 degrees below zero. And that's not accounting for wind chill, that measurement we use today to describe what the cold feels like against exposed skin. Back then, they didn't have a term for it. They just knew that wind made cold into a knife. This is the world the mountain men inhabited. Not by choice, really. They were there for fur, for beaver pelts that European fashion demanded for hats. They were there for adventure, for escape, for reasons as varied as the men themselves. But once winter came, once the snow started falling and didn't stop, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was making it to spring. And the first lesson winter taught them, the lesson it taught over and over until it finally sank in or killed you, was this: everything you think you need, you probably don't. And everything you think will save you probably won't. The Franklin expedition failed because they brought their idea of civilization with them. They dressed in wool uniforms designed for the decks of ships, not the ice. They ate food from tins, not understanding that the lead solder sealing those tins was poisoning them slowly. They stayed together in large groups, making noise, making targets, making themselves dependent on supply lines that didn't exist. The mountain men succeeded when they succeeded because they did the opposite. They split into small groups or traveled alone. They dressed in leather and fur, materials that breathed, that moved, that didn't trap moisture against skin. They ate fresh meat when they could get it, understanding that their bodies needed fat, needed protein, needed the very things that their civilized counterparts had been taught to moderate. But don't think the mountain men were immune to winter's judgment. They weren't. They made mistakes too, and winter punished those mistakes without mercy. There was a trapper named Daniel Potts who rode with the Ashley expeditions in the early 1820s. Potts was experienced, capable, not a greenhorn by any measure. But in the winter of 1822 or 1823, during a particularly brutal stretch of cold, he made a choice that seemed reasonable at the time. His moccasins had worn through, and he had no replacement leather, so he wrapped his feet in strips of blanket, thinking the wool would insulate well enough until he could get proper footwear. It didn't. The blanket absorbed moisture from sweat and snow. And because he kept moving, kept working, he didn't notice at first that his feet had lost feeling. By the time he did notice, by the time he unwrapped those wool strips and saw what the cold had done, it was too late. Frostbite had set in deep. The tissue was dead. He lost 3 toes on his left foot. Not to gangrene, thankfully, but to the simple fact that dead tissue can't be saved. A companion helped him remove them with a heated knife, cauterizing as they went. Potts survived, went on to trap for several more years. But he walked with a limp for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of one moment's poor choice in the face of winter's cold. If you had to choose right now between a thick, warm coat and a pair of thin moccasins, which would you pick? Most of us would choose the coat without thinking. We'd be wrong. The mountain men learned this through failures, through watching men die, through losing pieces of themselves. They chose the moccasins every time because frozen feet meant you couldn't walk. And if you couldn't walk in that wilderness, you were already dead. They chose right, but only after choosing wrong more times than we can count. They learned these things from watching, from the Crow and Shoshone and Ute peoples who had lived in these mountains for generations uncounted. You know, there's a humility in that kind of learning that we've perhaps lost. We think knowledge comes from books, from credentials, from having the right answer ready. But real survival knowledge, the kind that lives in your hands and your bones, often comes from silence, from having the courage to be the novice, the fool, the one who doesn't know. I think about that in my own life. The most important lessons never came while I was talking or proving a point. They came in the quiet moments of watching someone who truly knew their craft. A carpenter, a gardener, my own grandfather fixing an old engine. Your ego has to step aside. You have to let your assumptions freeze and shatter, just like the ice on a bucket, before you can drink the cold, clear truth. The mountain men, if they wanted to live, had to let go of being the civilized man from the East. They had to become students again. And the teacher was the land itself and the people who understood its grammar. That's a powerful metaphor for any of us trying to navigate a difficult season. Who are your silent teachers? Are you listening to them? Or are you too busy explaining the world to yourself? From seeing what worked and what killed. And most of all, from a willingness to abandon every notion of comfort they'd been raised with. There's a journal entry from Osborne Russell, a trapper who spent the winter of 1835 near what's now Yellowstone. He writes about waking one morning to find that the water in his canteen, which he'd kept inside his buffalo robe next to his body all night, had frozen solid. Think about that. The heat of a human body, wrapped in the best insulation available, wasn't enough to keep water liquid. And Russell's response? He doesn't complain, doesn't rage against the unfairness of it. He simply notes it matter-of-factly, the way you might note that it rained today, because complaining wouldn't change anything. Anger wouldn't make the cold relent. All it would do is waste energy, and energy was the one thing you couldn't afford to waste. This is what I mean by rejecting comfort. The mountain men didn't seek to make winter pleasant. They sought to make it survivable. And there's a world of difference between those two goals. Modern survival experts talk about something called the cotton killer. It's the tendency of cotton fabric, when wet, to draw heat away from your body so efficiently that it can induce hypothermia, even in relatively mild conditions. The mountain men didn't know the science behind it, but they knew the reality. Get your clothes wet, stay in your clothes, you die. It's that simple. So they wore leather that could be dried by a fire. They wore wool that insulated even when damp. They wore layers, yes, but not the bulky, restrictive layers we might imagine. They wore just enough because too much clothing made you sweat, and sweat was as deadly as ice. There's an account from Warren Ferris, another trapper, describing how the men would sometimes strip down in the middle of a snowstorm, down to bare skin, and rub themselves vigorously with snow. It sounds insane, doesn't it? But there was method in it. The friction created heat. The cold snow, paradoxically, felt warm against skin that had been covered and sweating. And most importantly, it dried the skin, removed the moisture that would otherwise freeze. Comfort says, stay bundled up, stay covered, stay warm. Survival says, strip down, embrace the cold, control the moisture. Comfort gets you killed. Survival gets you to mourning. The journals from this era are full of these little inversions. These moments where doing the sensible thing, the comfortable thing, leads to disaster, while doing something that seems absolutely mad keeps you alive. Joe Meek, one of the most famous mountain men, tells a story about a greenhorn, a new arrival, who insisted on building a large fire on his first night in the Rockies. Wanted to be warm, you see. Wanted that comfort. The fire attracted a grizzly bear, which scattered the camp and destroyed most of their supplies. But worse, from the perspective of survival, the large fire had made everyone drowsy, made them let their guard down. In winter, in that wilderness, letting your guard down was a luxury no one could afford. The experienced men, Meek said, kept small fires, Dakota-style fire holes dug into the ground where the flame was hidden, and the heat was concentrated for cooking, not comfort. They stayed alert, stayed cold enough that sleep was light, that any sound would wake them. They didn't enjoy their nights, but they survived them. The greenhorn learned, or he didn't last. This wasn't about being tough for toughness's sake. It wasn't machismo or some kind of contest. It was pure pragmatism, born of necessity. Winter in the Rockies was, in its way, a perfect teacher because it gave immediate feedback. Do the wrong thing, you die. Do the right thing, you see another sunrise. There's no clearer curriculum than that. And what winter taught above all else was humility. It taught that nature doesn't care about you. It doesn't hate you, but it doesn't love you either. You're just another warm-blooded creature trying to keep your blood warm in a world that wants to freeze it. No more, no less. The mountain men who survived multiple winters developed what we might call a stoic mindset, though they wouldn't have used that term. They accepted what they couldn't change. They didn't waste emotional energy on things beyond their control. The cold was cold, the snow was snow, the wind was wind. Complaining about it was like complaining about gravity. What they could control was their response, their preparation, their moment-to-moment decisions. And they poured all their focus into that narrow channel of agency. There's something almost meditative about the way they describe their routines. James Kleiman writes about the ritual of checking his rifle every morning, the methodical process of cleaning and drying it, even though he'd done the same thing the night before. It wasn't about the rifle being dirty. It was about the discipline, the focus, the assertion of control in a world trying to strip control away. So when I say winter was a judge, this is what I mean. It judged not your strength, though strength helped. Not your courage, though courage helped too. It judged your wisdom, your ability to learn, your willingness to let go of every comfortable assumption and face reality as it was, not as you wished it to be. And the judgment was final. There was no appeal, no second chance. You adapted or you ended. Now, before we go further, before we talk about the specific techniques these men used, I want you to understand something important. This isn't a story about superhuman figures. These weren't demigods or mythical heroes. They were human beings, as flawed and frightened as anyone. They made mistakes. They suffered. Some of them died doing everything right, just because luck ran against them. But what makes their story worth telling, worth remembering as you drift towards sleep tonight, is this. They proved that humans can endure things that seem unendurable, not by being stronger than the challenge, but by being wiser about how to meet it, by being willing to sacrifice the comfort of certainty for the uncertainty of survival. In our modern world, we've built elaborate systems to protect ourselves from discomfort. Climate control, food delivery, medical care, all wonderful things, all things I'm grateful for. But there's a cost to all this protection, and the cost is this. We forget what we're capable of. We forget that our ancestors, not so long ago, survived things we can barely imagine. And they did it not with technology, but with knowledge and will. The mountain men's winter was a winter of the body, yes, but it was also a winter of the spirit, a time of testing that revealed what a person was really made of. And in facing that test, in learning to live without the comfort they'd known, they discovered something valuable. They discovered that comfort and safety aren't the same thing. That sometimes the path to safety runs right through discomfort. That sometimes you have to get colder to stay alive. Let me ask you something. When you got dressed this morning, or yesterday, or the last time you went outside in cold weather, what did you do? You probably put on a coat, maybe a hat, gloves. You thought about staying warm. You thought about being comfortable. And that's perfectly reasonable. It's what I do too. But imagine if that decision, that instinct toward comfort, could kill you. Imagine if the wrong fabric, the wrong fit, the wrong number of layers meant the difference between living and dying. Suddenly, getting dressed becomes something else entirely. It becomes an act of calculation, of deep knowledge, of life or death importance. For the mountain men, that's exactly what it was. Now, when we think about clothing, we tend to think more is better. Cold outside? Wear more. Still cold? Wear even more. It's logical, it's intuitive. And in the world these men inhabited, it could kill you as surely as a bullet. Because the enemy wasn't just the cold. The enemy was moisture, sweat. The body's own attempt to regulate temperature becoming a trap that would freeze you from the inside out. The men who survived learned a principle that seems counterintuitive at first. Less could be more. Not less in the sense of going naked into a blizzard, obviously, but less in the sense of wearing just enough and no more. Wearing the right materials, arranged in the right way, so that your body's heat was preserved, but its moisture was managed. Let's start with the foundation, the layer closest to skin. Back east, a man might wear a cotton undershirt, soft, comfortable, familiar. In the Rockies, that cotton undershirt was a death sentence. Cotton holds moisture like a sponge, and then conducts heat away from your body with terrible efficiency. You'd sweat during exertion, the cotton would soak it up, and then when you stopped moving, when your body's furnace turned down, that wet cotton would chill you faster than bare skin would. So what did they wear instead? Often, surprisingly, they wore nothing beneath their outer garments. Or they wore thin wool, which has the almost magical property of insulating even when damp. Wool fibers trap air in tiny pockets, and those air pockets provide insulation. Even wet wool, up to a point, keeps you warmer than wet cotton ever could. But the real secret was leather, buckskin specifically, the hide of a deer, elk, or antelope processed in a particular way. Now, if you've never worked with brain-tanned leather, this might sound strange. The process involves taking the brain of the animal you've just killed and using it to soften the hide. Every animal, it's said, has just enough brain matter to tan its own hide. The work was laborious, and it was almost always done by women. Among the Crow and Shoshone, the wives and daughters spent countless hours transforming raw hides into the soft, supple buckskin that could mean the difference between life and death for their men. They would scrape the hide clean of flesh and fat, soak it in water, then work the brain matter into every inch of the leather with their hands. The natural oils and enzymes in the brain broke down the fibers in a way that no amount of stretching or beating alone could achieve. Then came the smoking. The hide would be suspended over a smoldering fire of rotten wood, the smoke permeating the leather, setting the tanning chemicals, giving the buckskin its characteristic smell and its water resistance. It took days of constant attention, of checking and rechecking, of knowing by touch and sight when the leather had reached that perfect state. The mountain men who took Indian wives learned to value this skill above almost anything else. A woman who could tan a hide properly was worth more than gold because she could keep you alive. She could turn the animals you killed into shelter, into clothing, into the very substance of survival. The trappers tried to learn the technique themselves, and some became passably good at it. But they knew, watching their wives and the women of the tribes they lived among, that this was an art refined over thousands of years, passed from mother to daughter in a chain of knowledge that stretched back to times they couldn't imagine. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had perfected this technique over thousands of years, and the mountain men learned it from them. The result was a leather that was soft, supple, and remarkably suited to winter survival. It breathed. That's the key word. Unlike modern synthetic materials that trap heat and moisture, buckskin allowed vapor to pass through while still blocking wind and providing insulation. It wasn't waterproof, but it was water resistant, and when it did get wet, you could dry it by a fire without it stiffening into an unwearable board. A typical trapper might wear buckskin leggings and a buckskin shirt, both fringed. Those fringes weren't decoration, though they looked fine. They were functional. Water runs down to the lowest point, and fringes provided that point, letting moisture drip away instead of soaking into the main body of the garment. Over the buckskin, when it was truly cold, they'd wear a capote. This was a coat made from a Hudson's Bay blanket, usually striped in patterns of white, green, red, and yellow. The thick wool was woven to be dense and warm, and the capote design, with its hood and belted waist, had evolved in Canada specifically for this kind of cold. A good capote could stop wind like a wall, while still allowing your body heat to stay where it belonged. But here's the interesting part, the part that shows how these men thought. They didn't always wear the capote. Even on cold days, if they were moving, working, exerting themselves, they'd leave it off. Because they knew that sweating into their base layer was more dangerous than being cold for a while. Better to be uncomfortably chilly and dry than comfortably warm and damp. There's an account from Daniel Potts, a trapper with the Ashley expedition, describing a forced march through deep snow in January. The men, he says, stripped down to just their buckskins despite temperatures well below freezing, because the effort of breaking trail was making them sweat. Anyone who kept their heavy coats on ended up soaked through, and when they stopped for the night, those men shivered uncontrollably while the half-dressed men, paradoxically, stayed warmer. Comfort says, bundle up, stay covered. Survival says, manage your heat, control your moisture, even if it means being cold for a while. Now let's talk about feet, because feet are where a lot of men died without ever being wounded. Boots, the kind a man might wear back east, were rigid leather, often with hobnails for traction. They kept water out fairly well, which seemed like a good thing. But they also kept moisture in, and they restricted blood flow. In extreme cold, when circulation to the extremities is already compromised, constricting your feet even slightly can mean the difference between keeping your toes and losing them to frostbite. The mountain men learned to wear moccasins instead. These were soft leather shoes made from a single piece of hide sewn with sinew. The crow style extended high up the leg. The sole was supple, allowing you to feel the ground beneath you, which helped with balance and silent movement. And crucially, they allowed blood to flow freely. Inside the moccasins, on the coldest days, a man might stuff grass or fur. These natural insulators created dead airspace around the foot while still allowing flexibility. And if your feet did get wet, you could quickly remake the stuffing from materials at hand. But wearing moccasins required a different way of walking, a different relationship with the ground. You couldn't just plow forward like you could in rigid boots. You had to step more carefully, feel your way, read the terrain through the thin sole. It took time to learn. Greenhorns often complained that moccasins weren't warm enough, weren't protective enough. The experienced men knew better. Moccasins kept you alive by keeping your feet connected to your body, blood flowing, sensation intact. There's a story Joe Meek tells about a French-Canadian trapper who insisted on wearing his European boots through a winter in the Snake River country. By spring, the man had lost 3 toes to frostbite, despite the fact that his boots had seemed, by every measure, warmer and more protective than moccasins. The lesson was clear. Comfort and survival, once again, were not the same thing. Hands were another challenge. Gloves, as we know them, thick and insulated, were rare. More often, the men wore mittens made from buffalo hide, with the fur turned inward. Mittens, by keeping the fingers together, preserved heat better than gloves, but they also reduced dexterity. You couldn't shoot a rifle or tie a knot easily while wearing them, so the men learned to work barehanded even in brutal cold for short bursts. They'd expose their hands to do whatever needed doing, then plunge them back into the mittens or into their armpits to rewarm. It was a constant dance, this balancing of function against preservation. And then there was the head. The human head, despite being only about 8% of body surface area, can lose up to 45% of your body heat when exposed to cold. The mountain men knew this intuitively, even if they didn't know the physiology. They wore fur hats, often made from beaver or fox, with ear flaps that could be tied under the chin. Some wore wool caps underneath for an extra layer. A few, learning from the crow, wrapped their heads in strips of trade cloth, creating turbans that provided surprising insulation. But the real genius was in what they wore to sleep. And here we come to perhaps the most important single item in a mountain man's kit: the buffalo robe. A buffalo robe wasn't just a blanket. It was a sleeping system, a survival tool, a shield against death itself. Made from the winter hide of a buffalo cow, with the thick fur left intact, a good robe weighed 20 to 30 pounds. It was huge, easily 8 feet by 6 feet, and it was, pound for pound, the finest insulation available in the pre-industrial world. The secret was in the fur itself. Buffalo hair is hollow. Each individual hair contains a column of air, and air, trapped and still, is one of the best insulators known. Layer upon layer of these hollow hairs, densely packed, created a barrier that could keep a man warm, even when sleeping directly on snow. The technique was this. You'd find a spot, ideally out of the wind, scrape away loose snow if necessary, and lay down a base. Sometimes this was just a pile of pine boughs. Sometimes it was a piece of tanned leather, an epishimmer, which was the pad that sat under a pack saddle but doubled as a ground cloth. Then you'd lie down on top of the buffalo robe, pull it over yourself, and roll, burrito style, until you were completely encased. Your breath would create a small microclimate inside the robe, a pocket of warmth. Snow falling on the outside would actually help, adding another layer of insulation. And in the morning, if you'd done it right, you'd wake up stiff and sore but alive, your breath having frozen into a layer of ice on the inside of the fur near your face, but your core temperature maintained. Men who didn't have buffalo robes tried to make do with wool blankets. The Hudson's Bay Company sold 4-point blankets, heavy and well-made, and these helped. But they weren't the same. Wool, even thick wool, didn't have the loft, the air-trapping capacity of buffalo fur. On the coldest nights, the difference between a robe and a blanket could be the difference between sleeping and freezing. Today, you can buy a synthetic sleeping bag rated to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Modern materials, high-tech insulation, zippers and baffles designed by engineers. It will keep you alive in conditions that would have killed a poorly equipped trapper. But here's the thing. If you let moisture build up inside that bag, if you sleep in it wearing damp clothes, or if condensation from your breath soaks the insulation, it becomes the cotton killer in a new form. The synthetic fibers lose their loft, compress under the weight of ice crystals, and suddenly that -40 bag might as well be a bed sheet. The principle hasn't changed. Moisture management is still the key to survival in extreme cold. The technology is better, yes, but the wisdom, the understanding of how heat and moisture and insulation interact, that's the same wisdom the mountain men learned from the Crow and Shoshone. That's the knowledge that keeps you alive, whether you're wrapped in buffalo fur or the latest Gore-Tex. There are accounts of men without robes huddling together for warmth, 2 or 3 bodies under a single set of blankets, sharing heat. It worked after a fashion, but it required trust, vulnerability, a willingness to literally entrust your life to your companions. Not every man could do that. The lone trappers, the ones who worked solo, needed that buffalo robe. Without it, they simply couldn't survive winter in the high country. Now, I want to pause here and acknowledge something. As I describe these techniques, these garments, it's easy to romanticize them, to imagine that wearing buckskin and moccasins was somehow noble or pure or more authentic. But the men living this life didn't feel that way. They wore what they wore because it worked, not because it was romantic. Given the choice between buckskin and modern Gore-Tex, between a buffalo robe and a synthetic sleeping bag rated to -40 degrees, they'd have chosen the modern gear in a heartbeat. The point isn't that old ways are better. The point is that these men figured out how to survive in conditions that should have killed them, using only what was available. And that, I believe, is the core of true resourcefulness. It's not about having the perfect tool, but about understanding the principle so deeply that you can improvise the tool from whatever is at hand. It's a mindset. I've seen it in people who've weathered great hardship. They don't see obstacles the same way. They see components, possibilities. A broken piece isn't just trash. It might be a lever, a patch, a lesson. The mountain men, wrapped in their buffalo robes, were practicing a form of extreme pragmatism. They were asking the most fundamental question: what is the need, and what here can meet it? We ask that too seldom. We see a problem and immediately think, what can I buy to fix this? Or, who can I pay to make it go away? There's a disconnection there. Sometimes, the solution isn't in adding something new, but in understanding more deeply what you already have and what you yourself are capable of. Your mind, your two hands, your willingness to try and fail and try again. That's the original survival kit. Everything else is just supplemental. They learned through trial and error, through watching people who'd been doing it longer, through making mistakes that sometimes cost lives. And what they learned was this: survival clothing isn't about comfort. It's about managing the physics of heat transfer, moisture, and insulation as efficiently as possible. In our world, we have the luxury of comfort and efficiency together. We can be warm and dry without sacrifice. But understanding how it worked for them, understanding the thought process behind each choice, reveals something important about how humans adapt to extreme environments. It reveals that adaptation isn't about being tougher or stronger. It's about being smarter, about understanding the rules of the game you're playing and then playing by those rules, even when the rules seem harsh or counterintuitive. The mountain men, in their buckskins and buffalo robes, were playing by winter's rules. They couldn't change the cold, couldn't turn down the thermostat on the Rocky Mountains. So they changed themselves instead, changed what they wore, how they thought, what they were willing to endure. And that willingness, that flexibility, that rejection of comfortable assumptions in favor of uncomfortable reality was itself a kind of clothing, a mental garment that kept them alive when physical garments alone wouldn't have been enough. Because the truth is, you can wear all the right materials in all the right layers and still die if your mind gives up. If you decide that the discomfort is too much, that the cold has won, that there's no point in continuing. The men who survived weren't necessarily the ones with the best gear. They were the ones who woke up every morning, pulled their frozen moccasins onto their feet one more time, and decided to keep going. The clothing was important, but it was only part of the equation. The real insulation, the thing that really kept them warm, was something else entirely. It was the fire inside, the determination to see another dawn. And that's something no buffalo robe, no matter how thick, could provide. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're lying in your warm bed, comfortable and safe, and suddenly all the power goes out. The heating stops. The temperature in your room begins to drop, 1 degree per hour, then faster. Within a few hours, it's the same temperature inside as outside, and outside, it's well below freezing. What do? You'd try to start a fire, most likely. And if you have matches or a lighter, it's easy. But now, imagine you don't. Imagine you have only what a mountain man had: a piece of flint, a piece of steel, and char cloth or tinder. Imagine trying to create fire from scratch with numb fingers in wind that wants to steal every spark before it catches. Suddenly, fire stops being convenient. It becomes everything. It becomes the center of existence, the point around which all other activity orbits. For the mountain men, fire wasn't just about warmth, though warmth was certainly part of it. Fire was light in the long, dark nights. Fire was security against predators, both animal and human. Fire was the means of cooking, the way to make water safe, the tool for countless small tasks, from melting snow to sterilizing wounds. Fire was, in a very real sense, the dividing line between being human and being just another freezing animal waiting to die. But fire was also danger. A fire too big would attract unwanted attention. A fire in the wrong location could cause disaster, burning through dry grass under the snow and leaving you with no safe ground to stand on. A fire tended carelessly could set your only shelter, your only clothing, your only survival gear ablaze. And a fire extinguished, especially if you couldn't easily relight it, could mean death before morning. So the relationship these men had with fire was complicated, careful, almost reverent. They treated it with the respect you'd give to something that could save you or kill you with equal ease. The primary tool for making fire was a flint and steel kit, carried in a small leather bag along with char cloth and tinder. The principle is simple enough. Strike the steel against the flint at the right angle, and sparks fly off, tiny pieces of superheated metal that, if they land on char cloth, will smolder. Then you transfer that smoldering ember to a bundle of tinder, blow on it gently to introduce oxygen, and coax it into flame. Simple in principle, brutally difficult in practice, especially in cold and wind. James Clyman describes in his journal a night when he tried for over an hour to get a fire started in a snowstorm. His fingers, he writes, lost feeling after the first 10 minutes. The wind kept blowing out his tinder before it could catch. The char cloth, slightly damp from being in his possibles bag, wouldn't hold an ember. He went through his entire store of prepared tinder, then started tearing strips from his spare shirt to create more. Finally, after what must have seemed like an eternity, he got a tiny flame going, nursed it with breath and body blocking against wind until it was strong enough to add small twigs, then larger branches, then finally logs. That fire saved his life and the life of his companion, William Sublette, who by that point had stopped shivering, a bad sign meaning his body was shutting down. But Clyman's account isn't triumphant. It's matter of fact, almost embarrassed. He mentions that an experienced trapper should have been able to get fire going faster, that his technique was rusty. Even in the act of saving his own life, he's critiquing his performance. That's the mindset. Never satisfied, always learning, always aware that next time might be harder, and you need to be better. But here's something interesting that Clyman and others discovered. Sometimes you didn't have to start fire from scratch. Sometimes If you were very careful, you could keep fire going indefinitely, even while traveling. The technique involved creating a slow match, a piece of punk wood or fungus that would smolder for hours without bursting into flame. You'd light this from your evening fire, then carry it wrapped in green leaves or moss, inside a horn or metal container with small air holes. The smolder would persist, dormant but alive, ready to be blown into flame when you made camp the next night. It was temperamental. Too much air and it burned out. Too little and it suffocated. It needed checking every few hours. But when it worked, it meant you carried fire with you, carried that security, that lifeline wherever you went. There's something almost mythological about that, isn't there? Carrying fire through the frozen wilderness, keeping that essential spark alive through all hardships. The ancient Greeks had a story about Prometheus stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humanity. The mountain men lived a version of that story every winter, keeping fire alive not despite the world, but in defiance of it. But let's talk about the other side of fire, the strategic side, because the kind of fire you built depended entirely on your situation. If you were alone, deep in hostile territory, maybe Blackfeet or Arikara country, where being spotted meant being killed, you used what's called a Dakota firehole. This was a technique borrowed from plains tribes, and it was ingenious. You dig 2 holes in the ground about a foot apart. The first hole, maybe a foot deep and 8 inches across, was your fire pit. The second hole, slightly smaller, was your air intake. You dig a tunnel connecting them underground, so air could flow from the intake hole to the fire pit. Then you'd build your fire down in that pit below ground level. The advantages were remarkable. First, the fire was hidden. Unless someone was standing right over it, they couldn't see the flames, especially at night. Second, the draft created by the underground air channel made the fire burn hot and clean, very little smoke. Third, the surrounding earth absorbed much of the heat, making the fire efficient for cooking while radiating less heat upward where it might be felt by someone nearby. You'd cook your meat quickly over this hidden fire, maybe boil some water, then carefully extinguish it and cover the pit with dirt. In the morning, there'd be no trace you'd ever been there. This was fire as survival tool, stripped of every element except pure function. But if you were with a larger group, camped with friendly tribes, or in a relatively safe valley, you could afford a different kind of fire, a proper fire circle with multiple people around it, sharing the warmth and the light. These fires were social centers, places where stories were told and news was shared, where the loneliness of the wilderness was held at bay for a few hours. Joe Meek describes a Christmas celebration in the winter of 1829 or 1830, somewhere in the Wind River Valley. The trappers, he says, built a fire that could be seen for miles. They roasted meat, passed around a jug of whiskey that had been saved for the occasion, sang songs badly and loudly, and at midnight, in a moment of pure joy and foolishness, they fired their rifles into the air, a salvo of celebration that echoed off the mountains and announced to anyone within hearing that they were there, they were alive, and they didn't care who knew it. For one night, they allowed themselves the luxury of comfort, of being loud and visible and human in all the messy, joyful ways that humans are. They needed it, that release, that moment of warmth and connection. The loneliness had been building for months, the silence pressing in. and Christmas was an excuse to push back against it with noise and light and companionship. Of course, they paid for it. A week later, a band of crows showed up at their camp. They'd seen the fire from 20 miles away, heard the gunshots, and come to investigate. The crow were friendly enough, but they wanted to trade, and they had leverage. The trappers had announced their presence in the most dramatic way possible, so there was no point in trying to hide or move. The trade cost them ammunition they could barely spare, tobacco they'd been hoarding, a few knives and metal tools. Meek writes about it with a mixture of regret and fondness. The Christmas celebration had lifted their spirits, had reminded them that they were still human, still capable of joy. But it had also cost them resources and safety, had drawn attention they couldn't afford. That was the trade-off. Comfort for the spirit versus survival for the body. And in the end, they'd chosen both, knowing they'd pay the price, but deciding it was worth it anyway. Fire, in other words, was about choices, about understanding what you needed in any given moment, what you could afford to risk, what you were willing to sacrifice. And those choices extended beyond fire to work itself. Because here's something crucial about surviving winter in the Rockies. You couldn't just hunker down and wait it out. Staying still, staying inactive, was as dangerous as any blizzard. Partly, this was about heat generation. Your body is a furnace, burning calories to produce warmth. But that furnace needs to be stoked, and it needs to be active. When you're moving, working, your muscles generate heat beyond what your baseline metabolism provides. When you're still, especially when you're underfed, your body temperature drops. The men who survived learned to keep moving, to find work even when there didn't seem to be any. Checking trap lines even in the worst weather. Cutting and stacking firewood far beyond immediate needs. Scraping and treating hides. Repairing gear, mending moccasins, maintaining rifles. There was always something that needed doing, and doing it served two purposes. It generated heat, and it kept the mind occupied. That second part was just as important as the first, maybe more so. Winter in the wilderness is lonely, profoundly, dangerously lonely. Days could pass without seeing another person. Weeks, sometimes. The silence was absolute, except for wind and the occasional crack of a branch under snow. And in that silence, the mind could turn against itself. We have a term for it now. Seasonal affective disorder, SAD, caused by reduced exposure to sunlight and disruption of circadian rhythms. The mountain men didn't have the term, but they knew the reality. They called it cabin fever, or just the melancholy. It manifested as lethargy, despair, a sense of hopelessness that could be as deadly as any physical threat. The cure, they learned, was work. Purposeful, exhausting, never-ending work. Not because the work itself was always necessary, but because the alternative was to sit still and let the darkness in. There's an account from Warren Ferris, trapping in the winter of 1832 along the Snake River, about a companion whose name he doesn't record. The man had been fine in the autumn, capable and steady. But as the days grew shorter and the cold set in deeper, something in him started to break. At first, it was small things. He talked to himself while working, which wasn't unusual. Plenty of men did that to fill the silence, but his conversations became stranger. He'd argue with himself, take both sides of disputes, get angry at his own imaginary provocations. Then he started talking to his shadow, addressing it as if it were a separate person, asking it questions and waiting for answers that never came. Ferris tried to engage him, tried to pull him back to reality with work and conversation, but the man began to withdraw. He'd sit for hours staring at nothing, or he'd wake in the middle of the night convinced he'd heard voices calling his name from the forest. Once, Ferris found him standing in the snow in his underclothes, listening intently to something only he could hear. The condition worsened. The man became convinced that the wind was speaking to him, that it was calling him to walk into the wilderness and never return. He'd fight the urge for days, then suddenly stand up and start walking. No coat, no provisions, heading out into the white. Ferris and the others would have to physically restrain him, bring him back to the fire, watch him constantly. In the end, they couldn't save him. One morning, they woke to find him gone. He'd waited until everyone was asleep, then slipped away into a blizzard. They found his body 3 days later, less than a mile from camp, frozen in a sitting position as if he'd simply decided to rest and never gotten up again. Ferris writes about it with a kind of horror, but also with understanding. He'd felt the pull himself, that whisper in the silence that said it would be easier to just stop, to give in, to let the cold take you. What separated him from his dead companion wasn't strength or courage. It was work, the simple, grinding routine of daily tasks that kept his mind occupied, kept him from listening too closely to the voices in the wind. The rest of them, Ferris says, doubled down on their routine after that. They made rules for themselves, schedules. Hunting in the morning, processing meat in the afternoon, gear maintenance in the evening. Every day the same. Not because it was fun or rewarding, but because it was the pattern that kept them sane. This is the part of winter survival that doesn't show up in the romantic accounts. The grinding, repetitive labor, the way that adventure reveals itself to be mostly drudgery interspersed with moments of terror. The realization that surviving isn't about one heroic act, but about 10,000 small acts of discipline, day after day, even when every fiber of your being wants to stop. There's a quote from Osborne Russell that captures it perfectly. He writes, "It is not the storm that kills, but the stillness after the storm. When a man decides there's no point in continuing, he's already dead. He just doesn't know it yet." Harsh words, but Russell knew what he was talking about. He'd seen men die that way, and he'd felt that pull himself, the whisper that said it would be so much easier to just lie down and let the cold take over. What kept him going, he says, was simply refusing to think about whether it was worth it. He treated staying alive as a job, something to be done regardless of how he felt about it. Not heroic, not inspiring particularly, just grimly functional. But functional was enough. Functional kept you breathing. Now, all of this, the fire and the work, was connected to something else these men learned. The danger of comfort. Not just physical comfort, but mental comfort. The feeling that you're safe, that you can relax, that the crisis has passed. Because in the winter Rockies, the crisis never passed. You might have good days, easy days, but complacency could kill you faster than anything. The moment you thought you had it figured out, thought you could coast, was the moment you made the fatal mistake. Jedediah Smith understood this better than most. Smith was a complicated figure, deeply religious, abstemious, not at all the stereotypical wild mountain man. But he survived where others didn't, because he never, ever allowed himself to feel safe. In 1823, Smith was attacked by a grizzly bear that nearly scalped him, tore off part of his ear, and mauled him badly. While his men stitched him back together, Smith planned the route forward. Days later, barely healed, he was back on the trail. Not because he was superhuman, but because stopping meant dying. The wilderness didn't care about his injuries. It would kill him just as easily damaged as whole. So, he kept moving. That refusal to stop, that stubborn insistence on continuing despite every reasonable argument for rest, became his defining characteristic. We often mistake that kind of stubbornness for mere toughness. But it's more nuanced than that. It's not a blind charge forward. It's a conscious daily choice. It's the voice in your head that, when every cell is screaming to lie down, says quietly, "Not yet. One more step." I've faced moments like that, not in a blizzard, but in the quiet desolation of a personal failure, or in the exhausting marathon of caring for a loved one. The principle is eerily similar. Heroism isn't a grand one-time gesture. It's the accumulation of 1,000 small, uncelebrated decisions to simply continue, to get up and make the coffee, to make the difficult phone call, to sit with the silence instead of running from it. The mountain men's. One more step was literal. Yours might be emotional or spiritual, but the machinery of the heart is the same. You disconnect from the overwhelming scale of the journey, the whole endless winter, and you focus on the next fire, the next meal, the next mile. You break eternity into manageable pieces of now, and in doing so, you discover that persistence isn't something you are, it's something you do. Again, and again, and again. And it kept him alive through winters and deserts and hostile territories that claimed the lives of many men who were, by any objective measure, tougher than he was. Because toughness, it turned out, wasn't the key quality. Persistence was. Stubbornness, the ability to wake up one more time, to face one more day of cold and hunger and danger, and to decide, again, to continue. Fire gave you the tool. Work gave you the method. But that decision, that daily renewed choice to persist, was what actually kept you alive. And nobody could make it for you. It was the one thing you couldn't learn from the crow, or borrow from a companion, or buy from a trader. You had to find it inside yourself. And then you had to find it again the next day, and the day after that, for as long as the winter lasted. Some men found it, some men didn't. And that, more than anything else, explained why some trappers became legends and others became frozen corpses found in the spring thaw, just another piece of wilderness debris. The fire kept burning, or it didn't. The work kept getting done, or it didn't. You kept moving, or you didn't. Winter didn't care which, but you did. And in the end, that was all that mattered. There's something we don't talk about much anymore. Something our modern world has worked hard to make us forget. Our bodies are machines. Biological machines, yes, with all the complexity that implies, but machines nonetheless. And like any machine, they run on fuel. They need input to create output. Heat, in particular, doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from burning calories, from converting the chemical energy in food into the thermal energy that keeps your blood liquid and your brain functional. In winter, in real winter, the kind the mountain men faced, your body's energy demands skyrocket. You're not just maintaining a comfortable 72 degrees in a temperature-controlled environment. You're maintaining 98.6 degrees when the air around you is 30, 40, 50 degrees colder than your core. That's a massive thermal gradient, and your body has to work constantly, burning fuel constantly to maintain it. The trappers needed somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 calories a day. Maybe more if they were doing heavy work or enduring particularly bitter cold. To put that in perspective, the average American today consumes around 2,000 calories. So we're talking about 2 or 3 times as much food just to stay alive. And not just any food, specific food, the right kind of fuel for the right kind of work. This is where survival and comfort part ways completely. Because the diet that would keep you alive in the winter Rockies bears almost no resemblance to what we'd consider a healthy, balanced diet today. It was almost entirely meat. And not lean meat, the kind we're told is good for us. Fatty meat, the fattier the better. Buffalo, elk, deer, bear, beaver, and not just the muscle tissue. The organ meats, the bone marrow, the tallow, the brain. Every part of the animal that contained fat was not just eaten, but prized, fought over, hoarded against times of scarcity. Because fat, in the arithmetic of winter survival, was worth its weight in gold. Maybe more. Let me explain the biology as simply as I can. When your body burns carbohydrates for energy, it produces heat, yes, but not as much as when it burns fat. Fat is energy dense, containing more than twice the calories per gram as carbohydrates or protein. But more than that, the process of metabolizing fat produces what are called ketone bodies, which your brain can use as an alternative fuel source when glucose is scarce. And ketone metabolism generates significant heat as a byproduct. In other words, eating fat doesn't just give you calories, it literally makes you warmer at a cellular level. The mountain men didn't know the biochemistry, but they knew the result. A man who ate fatty meat could maintain his body heat in conditions that would kill a man eating lean meat, even if both men consumed the same number of calories. It was a truth learned through brutal experience, written in the deaths of men who hadn't learned it fast enough. There's a syndrome that modern survival experts call rabbit starvation or protein poisoning. It happens when you eat only lean meat, nothing else. You can eat until you're full, consume thousands of calories, and still starve to death because your body can't process pure protein efficiently. You need fat, or you need carbohydrates, or ideally both, to properly metabolize the protein. The trappers saw this happen. They had a name for it, though not a scientific one. They called it the lean meat sickness, or just the wasting. Men would complain of bone-aching hunger, a feeling that no amount of meat could satisfy. They'd eat and still feel hollow, still feel weak. In the winter of 1830, a small group of trappers working the upper reaches of the Yellowstone River found themselves in exactly this situation. Game had been scarce for weeks, and what they could kill were snowshoe hares and the occasional lean deer, animals that had burned through their own fat reserves trying to survive the cold. The men ate constantly, consuming pounds of meat every day, but they kept losing weight, kept growing weaker. One man, according to the account passed down through Joe Meek, became too weak to walk. His companions tried everything they could think of. They fed him more meat, boiled it into broth, tried to get more calories into him. But he kept fading. His eyes took on a strange hollowness. His skin became grey. He complained that his bones hurt, that nothing tasted right, that he was hungry even after eating until he was sick. When they finally killed a beaver and rendered its fat-rich tail, when they fed him that gelatinous, oily substance, the change was almost immediate. Within hours, his color improved. Within a day, he was sitting up, asking for more. The fat had given his body what it desperately needed, what pure protein alone could never provide. Not all of them were so lucky. Rabbit starvation, when it went too far, when the body had already begun consuming its own muscle tissue in a desperate search for nutrients, could be irreversible. Men died with full bellies, their bodies wasted despite having eaten constantly. It was a cruel death, one that seemed to make no sense until you understood the chemistry of it. The cure was fat. A single meal heavy with tallow or marrow, and the symptoms would start to reverse. The hunger would ease, strength would return. It was almost miraculous to watch, according to accounts from men like Rufus Sage and Warren Ferris. So the successful trappers became connoisseurs of fat. They learned which animals at which times of year carried the most. Buffalo cows in late autumn, for instance, having fattened up on summer grass, were prized beyond measure. The hump meat, loaded with fat deposits, was fought over. The tongue, rich and fatty, was considered a delicacy. The marrow from leg bones, soft and unctuously rich, was sucked out and savored. Bear was especially valued because bears, preparing for hibernation, accumulated enormous fat reserves. A fat bear taken in late fall could provide hundreds of pounds of tallow, pure rendered fat that could be stored and used throughout the winter. Men would mix this fat with lean dried meat to create pemmican, or simply eat chunks of it raw, letting it melt on their tongues, feeling the instant surge of energy it provided. Beaver, too, for all that they were trapped for their fur, were eaten, and beaver tail, in particular, was considered excellent eating because it was almost entirely fat, a strange gelatinous substance that didn't taste like much but provided incredible fuel. The trappers would roast beaver tails over a low fire until the skin crisped and peeled away, revealing the pale fat underneath, and eat them with the kind of relish that civilized folk reserved for the finest roast beef. This isn't to say they never ate anything but meat. When they could get it, they'd eat roots, berries, wild onions, nuts. Diversity of diet helped ward off scurvy and other deficiency diseases. But these plant foods were supplements, garnishes. The foundation, the bulk of their calories, came from animals. Had to come from animals because in winter, plants were either buried under snow or dried to inedibility. And when times were hard, when game was scarce, they ate things that would horrify us today. Old bones found in the spring, remnants from last year's kills, would be cracked open and the ancient, rancid marrow consumed because it was fat, it was calories, it was fuel. Leather garments, if things got desperate enough, would be boiled to extract whatever nourishment they might provide. Dogs, horses, mules, all potential food if the alternative was starvation. There's an account from Joe Meek about eating his own moccasins after being trapped by a blizzard for 5 days without food. He describes cutting them into strips, boiling them until they were soft enough to chew, and forcing them down despite the taste. Leather, being processed animal hide, still contains some protein and trace nutrients, enough to keep him alive until the storm broke and he could hunt. Meek tells the story with humor, as he told most stories, making it sound like an amusing adventure. But reading between the lines, you can sense the desperation the animal need to survive that drove him to eat his own footwear. That's not comfort. That's not even civilization. That's just biology, stripped down to its essential truth. Consume calories or die. Now, there's one more food I need to talk about, because it defined winter survival for the trappers more than anything else. Pemmican. Pemmican was a Native American invention, perfected over centuries, and it's hard to overstate how important it was. It was, quite simply, the perfect survival food for cold weather travel. The process of making it went like this. You'd take lean meat, usually buffalo or elk, slice it thin, and dry it in the sun or over a low fire until it was completely desiccated. Then you'd pound it into a powder using stones. Meanwhile, you'd render fat from the same animal, heating it until it liquefied. When both were ready, you'd mix them together, sometimes adding dried berries for flavor and vitamin content in roughly equal parts by weight. The result was a dense, oily mixture that you could pack into leather bags or parfleches and carry indefinitely. Pemmican didn't spoil. It didn't freeze solid. It provided a nearly perfect balance of protein and fat, and pound for pound, it contained somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 calories. Think about that. A single pound could fuel a man for an entire day of hard work in extreme cold. The trappers learned to make it from the tribes they traded with, particularly the Métis people of Canada, who had refined the process to an art. They made it in enormous quantities when buffalo were plentiful. 100 pounds of pemmican could mean the difference between surviving winter and starving, so they treated it with appropriate reverence. In fact, pemmican was so valuable, so essential to survival and to the fur trade economy, that men went to war over it. In 1814, the governor of Assiniboia issued what became known as the Pemmican Proclamation, attempting to ban the export of pemmican from the region to cripple the rival Northwest Company's trading operations. The Métis people, whose livelihoods depended on pemmican production and trade, fought back. The conflict escalated into armed violence. Men died over this mixture of dried meat and fat. That's how valuable it was. That's how essential. Rufus Sage, traveling through the Rockies in the 1840s, describes pemmican as barely edible but absolutely essential. It didn't taste good, he admits. It was greasy, sometimes rancid, tough to chew, but it kept you alive. And in winter, that was the only criterion that mattered. There's something else about this meat-heavy, fat-heavy diet that the trappers discovered, though they didn't have the language to express it clearly. It made you mentally sharp, focused, alert in a way that a diet heavy in carbohydrates didn't. Modern research on ketogenic diets suggests why. When your body is primarily burning fat for fuel, when you're in a state of ketosis, your brain operates differently. Some people report increased mental clarity, steadier energy levels throughout the day, better mood regulation. The trappers, eating almost nothing but meat and fat for months on end, were essentially in perpetual ketosis. Whether this helped them survive is hard to say definitively, but the sharpness they needed, the constant vigilance, the split-second decision-making that meant life or death, all of that was potentially supported by their diet in ways they didn't consciously understand. What they did understand, viscerally, was that fat kept you warm, that you could feel the difference in your body between a lean meal and a fatty one, that in the deepest cold, when your teeth were chattering and your fingers were numb, a chunk of tallow could make you feel human again in a way that nothing else could. This is the part of their survival that's hardest for us to relate to today. We're taught that fat is bad, that we should eat lean proteins and lots of vegetables, that a healthy diet is varied and moderate. And in our world, that's true. We're not trying to survive in sub-zero temperatures. We're not burning 6,000 calories a day. Our bodies have different needs. But transplant us back to 1825. Put us in the Wind River Valley with nothing but what we could carry. And suddenly, all our modern nutritional wisdom becomes worse than useless. It becomes actively dangerous. Because your body, in that environment, doesn't need what's healthy. It needs what works. And what works is fat, lots of it, from animals you've killed yourself, eaten as fresh as possible, or preserved as carefully as you can manage. The mountain men became, in their way, carnivores. Not by choice, not because of any dietary philosophy, but because their environment demanded it. The plants had gone to sleep for winter. The cold required more calories than a human could reasonably obtain from foraged foods. So they ate meat, they ate fat, and they survived on a diet that would horrify every nutritionist in America today. And they were, by most accounts, remarkably healthy. Strong, lean, capable of tremendous physical exertion. Their teeth were often bad, yes, from lack of dental care and perhaps from gnawing on bones and hard-dried meat. But they didn't suffer from the diseases of modern civilization, the obesity and diabetes and heart disease that plague us now. They burned everything they ate. They used their bodies as they were designed to be used, as hunting tools, traveling tools, survival tools. There's a lesson in that, I think, though it's not a comfortable one. The lesson is that the human body is remarkably adaptable, that what we need depends entirely on what we're doing, where we are, what demands we're placing on our physical systems, that there's no one right way to eat, only ways that work for specific circumstances. The mountain men's diet worked for them in their specific hellish circumstance. It wouldn't work for us in ours, but understanding it, understanding why they ate what they ate, and how it kept them alive gives us a window into just how extreme their situation was, how far outside normal human experience they had pushed. And it reminds us, perhaps, that comfort and survival sometimes require opposite strategies, that the foods we enjoy, the balanced meals we prepare, are a luxury of peace and plenty. But that luxury away put us back in a world where every calorie has to be earned and every meal could be your last. And suddenly, our priorities would shift. We'd stop caring about balanced nutrition and start caring about one thing only: making it to tomorrow. The trappers made it to tomorrow by eating fat, by consuming the richest, densest fuel their environment could provide, by turning their bodies into furnaces and stoking those furnaces with everything they could kill or scavenge or trade for. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't clean. It wasn't what anyone would choose if they had a choice. But it was, undeniably, what worked. And in the end, that's all any of them cared about. Not the taste, not the healthfulness, not the long-term consequences. There's a brutal clarity in that question. Does this keep me alive today? It strips away all the noise, the preferences, the philosophies, the stories we tell ourselves about how life should be. It forces a confrontation with reality, with necessity. In our insulated lives, we can afford to have opinions, aesthetics, diets, ideologies. We can debate what's optimal. But when you're pressed against the edge, those debates evaporate. All that's left is function. I don't romanticize that edge. It's terrifying and dehumanizing. But visiting it in our minds through stories like these can be clarifying. It asks us, what are the essentials in your life? What are the buffalo fat and pemmican of your existence? What actually fuels you, sustains you, keeps your inner fire burning? And what is just the decorative fringe, the pleasant but dispensable comfort? We rarely ask because it's uncomfortable, but sometimes, in our own times of crisis or transition, that question surfaces on its own. And in answering it, we might find we've been carrying a lot of weight that isn't keeping us alive. It's just keeping us comfortable. And as these men learned, those two things are not always the same. Just, does this keep me alive today? And if the answer was yes, they ate it. Everything else was just noise. Evil. Fights broke out over real or imagined slights. Men who'd been alone too long sometimes couldn't adjust to having others around. Tensions ran high when resources were scarce, when the hunting was poor and everyone was hungry. But for all that, they needed each other, needed the shared warmth of communal fires, needed the shared labor of hauling water and chopping wood, needed, perhaps most of all, the simple fact of not being alone. At night, they'd huddle together around fires, sometimes literally pressed against each other for warmth. Any modern person would find this uncomfortable, this invasion of personal space. But the trappers learned to set aside such concerns. Pride and privacy are luxuries you can't afford when the temperature is 40 below. There's an account from Osborne Russell describing a night when 6 men slept under 3 buffalo robes, arranged in a line, each man's back pressed against the next man's front, rotating positions every few hours so that no one stayed on the cold outside edge too long. Russell writes about it without embarrassment or humor. It was just what you did. You shared heat, you shared life, and you didn't think too much about it. They also shared stories. This was crucial. In the long, dark evenings when there was nothing to do but wait for sleep, the trappers would tell tales. Adventures they'd had, close calls, funny moments, tragic losses. These stories served multiple purposes. First, they were entertainment, a way to pass the time and keep minds occupied. But second, and more importantly, they were education. A story about someone who made a mistake and died was a warning, a lesson passed on to younger or less experienced men. A story about a clever solution to a problem was useful knowledge, something that might save your life one day. Joe Meek was famous for his storytelling. He had a gift for it, a way of spinning even the most mundane events into something compelling. He'd talk about fighting grizzlies, about narrow escapes from hostile tribes, about friends he'd lost, and fortunes he'd almost made. Some of it was exaggerated, certainly, but all of it was rooted in the reality of what it meant to live that life. And the men would listen, gathered around fires, because the stories reminded them that they weren't alone in their struggles, that others had faced similar challenges and survived, or faced them and died. And either way, there was meaning in that. There was connection. Now, I need to talk about the Native Americans, because you can't understand the mountain men's winters without understanding their relationship with the tribes they encountered. It was complicated, sometimes hostile, sometimes friendly, often somewhere in between. But when winter came, when survival was on the line, many trappers chose to live with or near Indian villages. The Crow, in particular, were generally welcoming. The Shoshone, too, the Nez Perce. These tribes had their own reasons for accepting white traders into their camps, mostly related to access to guns, metal tools, and trade goods. But the arrangement was mutually beneficial. The trappers learned survival techniques that no white man could have figured out on his own. How to build a proper buffalo hide lodge, for instance, which was warmer and more weather-resistant than anything canvas could provide. How to smoke meat properly so it would last the entire winter. How to read weather signs, animal behavior, the 1,000 small indicators that told you when a storm was coming or where game might be found. Some trappers went further. They married Indian women. Country marriages performed according to tribal custom. These weren't casual relationships. They were strategic alliances, yes, but also genuine partnerships. The women brought essential skills. They could tan hides, sew clothing, prepare food, manage a household, all things that a lone trapper would struggle with. More than that, they provided companionship, connection, a reason to care about surviving beyond mere stubbornness. And the marriages created obligations, bonds of kinship that extended to the woman's entire tribe. You weren't just marrying an individual, you were marrying into a community. That community would feed you when you were hungry, shelter you when you were exposed, defend you when you were threatened. In return, you were expected to contribute, to hunt for the tribe, to fight if necessary, to behave honorably. It was a trade, but one that acknowledged a fundamental truth. You couldn't make it alone. There's a man I want to tell you about, because his story illustrates this better than any general description could. His name was Edward Rose, and he was a black man, possibly of mixed Cherokee heritage, who lived with the Crow for much of his adult life. Rose worked as a translator and guide for various fur trading expeditions in the 1820s and early 1830s. But unlike most trappers, who visited Indian villages and then moved on, Rose integrated fully into Crow society. He married a Crow woman, learned the language fluently, adopted their customs, and became, by all accounts, a respected member of the tribe. Some sources suggest he achieved a position of considerable status, that the Crow treated him almost as royalty because of his skills and knowledge. Rose understood something that many of his white contemporaries struggled with. Survival in the Rockies wasn't about conquest or dominance. It was about adaptation and cooperation. The Crow knew how to live in that landscape. They'd been doing it for generations. So rather than trying to impose his own ways, Rose learned theirs. And in doing so, he survived where more prideful men died. His story also complicates the narrative we often tell about the frontier. It wasn't just white men versus nature. It wasn't even just white men versus Indians. It was a complex web of interaction, trade, marriage, conflict, and cooperation. People of different backgrounds learning from each other, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, but always in relationship. And winter intensified all of it. Because winter stripped away the non-essentials. In summer, you could afford to be independent, to take risks, to maintain distance. In winter, you needed allies. You needed community. And you'd find it wherever you could. Now, let's talk about what happened when that community broke down, when men were forced to winter alone. It was rare, because even the most hardened trappers understood the danger. But sometimes circumstances forced it. Maybe you got separated from your party during a storm. Maybe you chose to trap in an area too remote or dangerous for others to follow. Maybe you just valued solitude more than safety. Whatever the reason, wintering alone was a test that most men failed. The physical challenges were immense. Everything that required two men, you had to do alone. Can't take turns on watch, so you never truly rest. Can't share the labor of camp maintenance, so you're constantly exhausted. Can't pool resources, so when your supplies run low, you have no backup. But the psychological challenges were even worse. The human mind needs stimulation, interaction, feedback from other minds. Without it, strange things start to happen. You might start talking to yourself, having conversations with imaginary companions. You might start attributing human qualities to animals or objects, seeing faces in tree bark, hearing voices in the wind. Some men handled it better than others. Jedediah Smith, with his strong religious faith, apparently found solace in prayer and scripture reading. He could go long periods without human contact because he felt he had a relationship with God, a connection that sustained him. But Smith was unusual in this regard. Most men weren't so internally fortified. Joe Meek, during his lost winter in 1829, describes nearly going mad from loneliness. He says he talked to his mule constantly, had long conversations with it as if it could answer. He named rocks and trees, created a mental landscape populated with companions even though he was, in reality, completely alone. It was a coping mechanism, a way to stave off the psychological collapse that threatened to overtake him. And when spring finally came, when he finally found his way back to civilization, or what passed for it, Meek says he couldn't stop talking. He talked for days, pouring out words as if making up for all the words he'd held inside during those months of solitude. His companions thought he'd actually gone mad. Maybe he had, a little, but he'd survived, and that was what mattered. The point is this: humans need other humans. It's not weakness, it's biology. We evolved in groups, and we function best in groups. Isolation for extended periods breaks something in us, makes us less than what we're meant to be. The mountain men, for all their self-reliance, knew this. They sought community when they could. They built it where it didn't exist, and when they couldn't find it, when circumstances forced them into solitude, they suffered for it, even if they survived. There's one more aspect of winter community I want to touch on, and it's perhaps the most important: the shared recognition that you are all in this together. When you're part of a winter camp, when you're one of 20 or 30 men hunkered down in some valley waiting for spring, social hierarchies matter less. The man who was rich and successful in summer becomes just another cold body in winter. The greenhorn who made mistakes might learn quickly and prove valuable. The old hand who knows every trick might teach you the one thing that saves your life. You become equalized by shared hardship, and in that equalization, there's a strange kind of comfort. You're not alone in your struggle. Everyone here is cold. Everyone here is hungry. Everyone here is just trying to make it through. That shared experience creates bonds, sometimes temporary, sometimes lasting years beyond the winter itself. The journals and memoirs from this era, when they talk about these winter camps, often do so with a fondness that seems out of place. These were not pleasant times. Food was often scarce. The cold was relentless. Boredom and tension were constant companions. And yet, the men remember them almost nostalgically, as if those winters represented something valuable that they couldn't quite name. I think what they valued was the community, the sense of common purpose and mutual dependence. It's something our modern world makes hard to find. We're isolated in our comfort, separate in our success. We don't need our neighbors in the same visceral way anymore. And that isolation, I fear, is its own kind of winter. We've built amazing systems to provide for our physical needs alone, but we've often walled off the pathways to our human ones. The shared labor, the collective breath around a fire, the unspoken understanding that your survival is tied to mine. These aren't just practical arrangements. They're the threads that weave a soul into a community. I've felt the lack of that, and perhaps you have too. The strange loneliness that can persist even in a crowd or in a busy online life. The mountain men's winter forced interdependence upon them. Our challenge is to choose it voluntarily, to build fires of connection even when the weather seems fair, to be the one who keeps watch while another sleeps, to share our stories, not just our highlights, to remember that vulnerability, the need for help, The admission of fear isn't a weakness. In the deep cold, it was the first step toward warmth. It still is. The most important shelter they built wasn't made of hides or logs. It was made of trust. And that's a structure we can all begin building right where we are. And maybe we've lost something in that, some essential human experience of being truly needed and truly needing in return. The mountain men had no choice. Winter forced them together, and in that forcing, in that necessary closeness, they found something that kept them not just alive, but human. They found that they weren't alone, that their struggles mattered to someone, that their stories would be heard and remembered. And when spring came, when the snows melted and the streams ran high, and it was time to scatter again into the mountains, they carried that with them, the memory of community, of warmth shared and stories told, of nights when they'd been cold together, and mornings when they'd woken up still breathing because someone else had kept the fire going while they slept. That was worth something. That was worth everything. I've told you a lot tonight about how the mountain men survived winter, about their clothing and their fires, their food and their mindset, their hard-won knowledge and their desperate community. I've tried to paint a picture of what it was like, what it meant to live that way. But there's something missing from all of that, something essential. Because these weren't just abstract principles or survival techniques. These were real events, real moments, real men facing real death and somehow finding a way through. So before we end, I want to share with you something different. Not my interpretation, not a summary, but a first-hand account. Words written by a man who was there, who lived it, who survived to tell the story. His name was James Clyman. You've heard me mention him before. He was one of the original trappers who went west with William Ashley in the early 1820s. He was with Jedediah Smith when they rediscovered South Pass. He was there for the fight with the Arikara. He was, in short, present for many of the defining moments of the fur trade era. But more importantly for our purposes, Clyman kept a journal. And in that journal, he recorded this. It was late in the season, probably December of 1823, though Clyman doesn't give the exact date. He and William Sublette, another trapper who would later become famous, had left the main camp to hunt. The camp was wintering in the Wind River Valley with a band of crow, and meat was running low. Everyone was hungry, and two good hunters might be able to bring back enough buffalo to feed the group for a week or more. They rode out in the morning, leaving early to cover as much ground as possible. The weather was cold but clear, which seemed like good luck. They'd find game, make their kill, and be back to camp by nightfall. Simple plan. The kind of plan that gets men killed. By afternoon, they'd spotted a small herd of buffalo along the Popo Aggie River, a tributary of the Wind River. Getting close required patience. Buffalo have good senses, and in winter, when food is scarce for them too, they're nervous and easily spooked. Clyman and Sublette dismounted, left their horses, and crawled through the snow on their bellies, inching forward until they were in range. Clyman took the shot, hit a cow, but not fatally. She ran, and they had to chase her down, which took time and energy. By the time they finally killed her and started the work of butchering, The sun was already low. And that's when the wind changed. It came from the north, sudden and sharp, bringing with it a front of bitter cold that made the already freezing air feel like knives. Within an hour, snow was falling, thick and wind-driven, turning the world into a white chaos where you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. They tried to build a fire with the sparse brush nearby, sage mostly, which burns fast and hot but doesn't last. They got a small fire going, roasted some of the fresh buffalo meat, and ate standing there, knowing they were in trouble but not yet panicked. Kleiman writes that Sublette wanted to try for camp, thought they could make it if they rode hard. But Kleiman, who'd lived through enough blizzards to know better, said no. Traveling in a whiteout was suicide. They'd get lost, lose the horses, and freeze to death before morning. Better to stay put, endure the night, and travel in the morning when visibility improved. So they did the only thing they could. They took the fresh buffalo hide, the one they just removed from the cow, and used it as shelter. They lay down on the frozen ground, pulled the hide over themselves, and waited for the storm to pass. Kleiman describes that night in detail, and you can feel the misery coming through the pages. The ground beneath them was frozen solid, drawing heat from their bodies no matter how they arranged themselves. The hide, still wet with blood and not yet properly dried, provided some protection from the wind and snow, but no real warmth. They couldn't sleep, not truly, because sleeping meant stopping movement, and stopping movement meant hypothermia. So they dozed fitfully, shifting position constantly, trying to stay conscious and alert. Hours passed. How many? Kleiman couldn't say. Time stretches strangely in darkness, and cold becomes elastic, unreliable. But eventually, in the deepest part of night, he realized that Sublette had stopped moving, was just lying there, still, his breathing shallow and slow. Kleiman knew what that meant. Sublette was shutting down, his body's core temperature dropping below the point where normal function was possible. If left alone, he'd simply slip away, freeze to death despite the buffalo hide, despite Kleiman's presence, because the cold had found a way in and was slowly claiming him. So Kleiman made a decision. He had to get a fire going. Not a small fire for cooking, but a real fire, a life-saving fire. But here's the problem. His hands were numb, almost useless. His flint and steel were damp from snow. His tinder, what little he had, was probably too wet to catch. He tried anyway, got out his kit, tried striking sparks. Nothing caught. Tried again. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The cold had defeated him, turned his skill and knowledge into useless gestures against the wind. Now, here's where Kleiman's account becomes something remarkable. Because at this point, most men would have given up, would have decided that fate was against them, that they'd tried their best and it hadn't been enough, and that was that. But Kleiman didn't give up. He couldn't, because giving up meant Sublette died, and probably Kleiman himself shortly after. So he did something that seems almost insane in the circumstances. He started digging through the snow with his numb hands, looking for the spot where they'd had their small cooking fire hours earlier. The fire was long since out, of course, covered by drifted snow. But maybe, just maybe, underneath that snow, underneath the ash and the cold, there might be a spark. one tiny ember that had survived, sheltered from the wind, keeping its heat in the heart of the ash. It was a desperate hope, almost certainly futile. But Kleiman dug anyway, following the vague memory of where the fire had been, scooping aside snow until his hands touched ash. And he found it. I'll let him describe it in his own words, as he wrote them. I came to a place where there was some small remains of fire, which I cleared away the snow from, and found a small coal not larger than a grain of corn. I then collected some dry bark and wood, and soon had a comfortable fire. Not larger than a grain of corn. Think about that. He found an ember the size of a kernel of popcorn in the middle of a blizzard, in the darkest hours before dawn, and he nursed that ember into a fire. He broke off dry bark from sage bushes, shielded it from the wind with his body, blew on that tiny coal with what must have been desperate, measured breaths, and somehow, impossibly, got a flame. And that flame saved them. Kleiman got the fire built up, moved Sublette closer to it, warmed him slowly and carefully so as not to cause shock. As Sublette thawed, he came back to himself, started moving and speaking again. They finished butchering the buffalo by firelight, loaded what they could onto their horses, and as dawn broke and the storm eased, they rode back to camp, alive. When I read that account, I'm struck by several things. First, by how close they came to dying. If Kleiman hadn't thought to search for that ember, if he just tried and failed with his flint and steel, and then given up, both men would have been found in the spring thaw, frozen corpses under a buffalo hide. The margin between survival and death was literally the size of a corn kernel. But second, and maybe more importantly, I'm struck by what it reveals about Kleiman's character. He didn't give up. That's the final lesson, the one that lives beneath all the techniques and the gear. It's not about never feeling despair. I imagine Kleiman felt a crushing wave of it when his numb fingers failed with the flint and steel. The true act of courage is what comes after that feeling. It's the decision to dig, literally in his case, through the snow. Metaphorically, in hours, through the despair, the apathy, the resignation. It's the belief, against all evidence, that there might still be an ember, a chance, one tiny glowing possibility. We all have that capacity, not to be fearless, but to be stubbornly, creatively hopeful in the face of the evidence, to look at a situation that seems utterly final, a frozen night, a broken dream, a seemingly endless winter of the spirit, and to ask, what if I just dig here? That question is a spark in itself, and sometimes just often enough to change everything. Your fingers touch not just cold ash, but a residual warmth. And that's all you need to begin. Even when the odds were against him, even when the rational conclusion was that he'd failed and death was inevitable, he kept trying, kept thinking, kept moving. And that persistence, that stubborn refusal to accept defeat, was what saved them. This is what I've been trying to convey all night. The techniques mattered, yes. The clothing and the food and the fire-building skills, all of that was essential. But beneath all of it, supporting all of it, was something less tangible, but perhaps more important. The will to survive. The decision, made and remade every moment, to keep going. Kleiman had that will. Sublette had it too. though it faltered that night and needed climate support. And all the mountain men who survived multiple winters, who made it through when others didn't, they all had it. Not because they were special or superhuman, but because they'd learned, through harsh experience, that giving up was the one thing they couldn't afford. Winter was a teacher, as I said before, and what it taught was humility. Yes, but also persistence. It taught that the world doesn't care about your comfort or your plans, or your very reasonable desire to not be in pain. It taught that survival comes down to simple, unglamorous actions repeated endlessly. Striking flint until your fingers bleed, walking when you'd rather lie down, eating when you're too tired to chew, breathing when breathing hurts. And it taught that sometimes, if you're lucky, you find an ember the size of a grain of corn. And if you're skilled and determined, you can turn that ember into a fire. And that fire can mean the difference between everything and nothing. Kleiman and Sublette made it back to camp. They delivered the buffalo meat. The group ate and was strengthened by it. And life went on the way life does. The story could have ended differently, could have ended with two bodies found in spring. One more small tragedy in a landscape full of tragedies. But it didn't, because James Kleiman refused to let it. And so, we come to the end of tonight's journey. Back from the frozen wilderness of the 1820s to the warmth and safety of your own bed. Back from the company of men who had to fight for every breath to the comfort of your own easy breathing. I hope you're warm right now. I hope you're comfortable, secure, drifting towards sleep in the knowledge that you'll wake up tomorrow without having to question whether you will. That's a gift. That's security. A luxury that the mountain men would have found almost unimaginable. But I also hope you'll remember them. Not as distant historical figures or romanticized frontiersmen, but as real human beings who faced impossible circumstances and somehow endured. Who learned to reject the very idea of comfort because comfort was a trap, a lie that winter told right before it killed you. They survived by being smarter than the cold, by learning from people who'd been doing it longer, by adapting constantly to conditions that wanted them dead, and by refusing day after day after day to give up. That's a lesson that reaches across the centuries, I think. Not that we should go sleep on snow or eat nothing but fatty meat or any of the specific techniques they used. Our lives don't require that. But the principle underneath those techniques, the stubborn persistence in the face of overwhelming odds, the willingness to do whatever needs doing, even when it's uncomfortable or frightening or seemingly pointless, that principle still applies. We all have our winters. Not literal ones, for most of us, but metaphorical ones. Times when everything seems hard, when the path forward isn't clear, when the easy choice is to stop trying and accept defeat. In those times, maybe it helps to remember James Kleiman digging through snow, looking for an ember the size of a corn kernel, finding it, bringing it back to life, saving himself and his friend through nothing more than determination and skill. You have that capacity too. We all do. It's part of being human, this ability to endure, to adapt, to survive despite everything. The mountain men proved it in the most extreme way possible. but the proof exists in all of us. It's there when you need it. You just have to decide to use it. So sleep well tonight. Let the weight of your blankets remind you of how far we've come from those frozen nights in the Wind River Valley. Let the silence of your room be filled not with the howl of wind, but with the quiet knowledge that you're safe, that you're warm, that you're cared for. And tomorrow, when you wake, maybe take a moment to be grateful. Grateful for heat and food and shelter. Grateful that your survival doesn't depend on finding embers or eating fat or walking through snow until your feet bleed. Grateful that the hardest thing about your day probably won't be staying alive, but also, maybe, grateful for the knowledge that if it came to it, if circumstances changed and survival once again became a question rather than a given, you could do it. You could adapt. You could learn. You could persist, because that's what humans do. That's what we've always done. And the story of the mountain men is just one chapter in the long story of human persistence, human adaptability, human refusal to accept defeat. Their winter eventually ended. Spring came, as it always does. The snow melted, the rivers ran high, and life returned to the mountains. The men scattered again, back to their solitary trap lines, back to the business of living and surviving and searching for the next thing. But they carried with them the memory of that winter, the lessons learned, the friendships forged, the narrow escapes and small victories that together constituted survival. And they knew, even as they separated, that they'd likely do it all again next year. Because that was the life they'd chosen, or the life that had chosen them. Either way, it was theirs. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the past. I hope the story has given you something to carry with you into your dreams. Maybe a sense of perspective or gratitude, or simply the comfort of knowing that humans have faced and overcome far greater challenges than any we're likely to encounter in our climate-controlled, well-fed, modern lives. Sleep well, friend. Sleep deep, and know that while you rest, the history we've explored tonight continues to exist, continues to matter, continues to teach us about who we were and therefore who we are. Until next time, this is Peter Miller, wishing you the warmest of nights and the gentlest of journeys into sleep. The fire's still burning somewhere. Keep it alive. Keep yourself alive. And remember, you're stronger than you know. We all are. We just have to believe it when it matters most. Good night.